Rude Millionaire found a janitor sleeping in the supply closet. What he discovered changed everything. "Get out!" David Hartwell's voice thundered through the supply closet. She pressed her ear against the supply closet door, listening for footsteps in the marble corridors of the Hartwell Financial Tower in downtown Chicago. When silence confirmed her safety, Elena Martinez slipped inside and finally allowed her exhausted body to collapse. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. David Hartwell's Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floors of his Manhattan penthouse office at 2:47 a.m., the city's glittering lights casting shadows across his granite desk. Sleep had abandoned him again. Another night haunted by numbers, deals, and the relentless pursuit of more. At 42, he'd built an empire that stretched from the Chicago financial district to the tech corridors of Austin, Texas. But emptiness echoed in every corner of his success. The janitor's uniform hung loose on Elena's small frame as she curled against the metal shelving, her cleaning cart serving as a makeshift pillow. At 28, she'd learned to find rest wherever she could. Bus stops in Detroit during her journey west, park benches in Denver when motels were too expensive, and now this closet in the heart of Chicago's financial district. Her daughter Isabella's school photo, creased from constant handling, remained clutched in her palm even in sleep. David's phone buzzed. Another acquisition opportunity in Miami. He answered without greeting, his voice sharp as the winter wind off Lake Michigan. "The Miami Beach property better be worth interrupting my night, Reynolds." Money talked, people whispered, and David Hartwell listened only to profit margins. The caller's nervous explanations about zoning issues and delayed permits earned nothing but icy dismissal. Fix it or find someone who can. In the closet 17 floors below, Elena stirred as cleaning supplies shifted above her. A bottle of industrial cleaner had been her dinner's companion, its chemical smell masking the scent of the peanut butter sandwich she'd rationed into 3 meals. Her paycheck from Hartwell Financial would arrive in 6 days. 6 days too late to prevent eviction from the cramped Chicago apartment she shared with 2 other women. The streets had taught her that survival required swallowing pride, and sleeping in the supply closet was just another compromise in a life built from them. David descended to the executive garage, his silver Bentley waiting in its reserved spot. The drive through Chicago's empty streets should have calmed him, but restlessness clawed at his chest. Success had been his drug of choice for 2 decades, but lately the high lasted shorter, demanded more, gave less. He thought of his penthouse in Miami Beach, empty except for expensive art and echoing silence. His condo in Austin sat equally vacant, another monument to achievement that felt increasingly hollow. Elena's dreams carried her to better days, Isabella laughing on the swings at Lincoln Park, her daughter's hand warm in hers as they shared ice cream near Millennium Park. Before the accident, before medical bills consumed their savings, before her ex-husband disappeared with their security and dignity. Now Isabella lived with Elena's sister in Los Angeles, safe but distant, while Elena fought to rebuild what had shattered. Every night cleaning office buildings in Chicago was another step toward bringing her daughter home. The elevator in Hartwell Financial Tower climbed silently toward David's office, but tonight something felt different. Perhaps it was the way shadows fell across the building directory, or how his footsteps echoed differently in the marble lobby. He'd built this empire on instinct, and instinct whispered that tonight would matter. The security guard nodded respectfully. Even at 3 a.m., David Hartwell commanded deference. But in 17 floors of glass and steel, power felt more like a prison than a palace. Elena shifted in her makeshift bed, the supply closet's narrow confines forcing her body into uncomfortable angles. The industrial carpet scratched against her cheek, but it was warmer than Chicago's November streets. Tomorrow she'd clean these same floors, invisible to the executives who walked past her as if she were another piece of office equipment. But tonight, for a few stolen hours, she could rest without fear, judgment, or cold. David's keycard beeped as he entered his executive floor, but instead of heading directly to his office, something pulled him toward the operations wing. The building felt different in darkness, less like a monument to his success, more like a mausoleum of missed connections. His empire stretched from the Florida Keys to the Oregon coast, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd truly seen the people who made it possible. What do you think drives people to such desperate measures for survival? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective might change someone's life. The supply closet door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, David saw something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and the true cost of building empires on the backs of invisible people. The supply closet door swung open with a soft creak that might as well have been thunder in the silent corridors of Hartwell Financial Tower. David's breath caught as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing a figure curled impossibly small among the cleaning supplies, a woman in a janitor's uniform, her dark hair spilling across a makeshift pillow of folded towels. Elena's eyes snapped open, pupils dilating in terror as the hallway light framed David's imposing silhouette. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then panic flooded her system like ice water, and she scrambled upward, knocking over bottles of floor cleaner that clattered against the metal shelving with sharp, accusatory sounds. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the building's mechanical hum. "Please, I'll leave. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her hands shook as she reached for her worn canvas bag, the photo of Isabella fluttering to the floor between them. David stared at the photograph, a little girl with Elena's same dark eyes and hopeful smile, standing in front of what looked like Lincoln Park's zoo. The image hit him like a physical blow, though he couldn't understand why. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out harsher than intended, the automatic authority that had built his empire from Miami's financial district to Seattle's tech corridors. "I work here," Elena said, her chin lifting slightly despite her trembling. "I clean the 17th through 20th floors. Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Each word was measured, careful, as if she were reciting her right to exist in his world. "That doesn't explain why you're sleeping in my building." David's tone could have frozen Lake Michigan in July. He'd fired executives for lesser infractions, demolished companies for challenging his authority. But something about the way she clutched that photograph made his chest tighten inexplicably. Elena's eyes darted toward the exit, calculating escape routes like a trapped animal. "My apartment. The rent." She stopped, dignity warring with desperation. "I have nowhere else to go tonight. Tomorrow I'll find somewhere. I promise I won't. Tomorrow." David stepped closer, and Elena pressed herself against the supply shelves. The scent of industrial cleaner and human exhaustion filled the small space. "How long has this been going on?" 3 nights. The admission came out like a confession torn from her throat. Just 3 nights. The landlord changed the locks early. "I tried the women's shelter on North Wells, but they're full until next week. I tried," her voice cracked, years of held-together composure finally fracturing. "I tried everything." David's eyes traced the careful way she'd arranged the space, towels folded precisely for cushioning, supplies organized so nothing would spill, a small battery-powered alarm clock set for 5:30 a.m. Even in desperation, she'd maintained order, respect for property that wasn't hers. It reminded him of someone, but the memory danced just beyond reach. "You have a daughter." It wasn't a question. The photograph lay between them like evidence of Elena's humanity, demanding acknowledgement. "Isabella. She's 6. Elena's voice softened, love transforming her frightened features. "She lives with my sister in Los Angeles while I get back on my feet. I'm trying to save enough to bring her home for Christmas. To Chicago. We used to live near Wicker Park before." She stopped, walls slamming back into place. Before what? David found himself asking, though he'd never inquired about an employee's personal life in 20 years of business. Elena's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of life's cruel mathematics. Before her father decided Las Vegas was more appealing than responsibility. Before the medical bills from Isabella's pneumonia ate our savings. Before I learned that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll stay when things get difficult. The words hung in the air between them, and David felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd worn since building his first million. He thought of his own father, who'd worked 3 jobs in Detroit before David was born, sleeping in his car between shifts at the Ford plant and weekend construction gigs. The memory surfaced unwelcome and sharp. "The cleaning company doesn't know you're here," David said, his voice quieter now. "No." Elena straightened, preparing for termination, for the call to security that would destroy even this tenuous foothold. "I never sleep during work hours. I finish my assignments early and rest for a few hours before morning shift changes. The building is clean. I do my job." David studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the hallway. She was beautiful in the way that hardship carved beauty, all sharp angles and determined eyes, like his grandmother who'd raised him in Southside Chicago after his parents died. The recognition hit him suddenly, violently. She looked like family he'd forgotten, dreams he'd buried, the person he'd been before success calcified his heart. "Stand up," he said. Elena rose slowly, her small frame dwarfed by his presence but her shoulders squared with whatever dignity poverty had left her. She expected dismissal, expected to be escorted from the building by security, expected to spend the night walking Chicago's frozen streets until dawn brought new possibilities for shelter. Instead, David bent and picked up Isabella's photograph, studying the little girl's gap-toothed grin. "She looks like you." "Everyone says that." Elena's voice carried the first hint of warmth he'd heard from her. David handed back the picture, their fingers brushing for an instant. Her skin was cold, rough from industrial chemicals and hard work. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a human connection he hadn't felt in years of handshakes and business dinners from Manhattan's Upper East Side to Beverly Hills. "Come with me," he said. Elena pressed herself deeper into the supply closet's corner, shaking her head with the fierce desperation of someone who'd learned that accepting help often came with unbearable costs. "No. No, I can't. I won't." Her voice cracked like ice under pressure. "I know what men like you want when they find women like me in situations like this." David's face went rigid, the words hitting him like a slap across his perfectly shaven jaw. "Excuse me." The temperature in the small space seemed to drop 10 degrees, his voice carrying the authority that had silenced boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. "I'm not stupid," Elena said, clutching Isabella's photograph against her chest like armor. "Rich man finds a desperate woman sleeping in his building at 3 a.m. I've heard this story before. I've lived this story before." Her dark eyes blazed with the fury of someone who'd fought too many battles to surrender easily. I'd rather freeze on lower whacker drive than become another transaction in your portfolio. The accusation struck David like a physical blow, rage and something else, hurt, flooding through his system. 20 years of ruthless business dealings, of crushing competitors and buying loyalty, had prepared him for every negotiation except this one. You think I'm propositioning you? Aren't you? Elena's laugh held the bitter edge of experience. Powerful men don't offer help without expecting payment. My ex-husband taught me that lesson in Las Vegas when he sold our wedding ring to pay gambling debts. The landlord in Denver taught me that lesson when he offered to work something out for late rent. So forgive me if I don't trust the kindness of millionaires who find women at their most vulnerable. David stepped back, his Italian leather shoes scraping against the concrete floor. In the harsh fluorescent light, Elena could see something shift in his expression. Surprise, then anger, then something that almost looked like shame. I was going to offer you a hotel room. The Fairmont on North Columbus Drive. Company account. No strings. There are always strings. Elena's voice softened slightly, but her posture remained defensive. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually you'd want something. They always do. And when I couldn't give it to you, I'd lose everything anyway. At least this way, I keep my dignity. The words hung between them like a wall built from years of disappointment and survival. David found himself remembering his first million, made through a real estate deal in Miami Beach that had displaced 3 families from their homes. He'd told himself it was just business, just the cost of success. But standing here, facing Elena's unflinching honesty, those justifications crumbled like sand. You don't know me, he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been in years. I know enough. Elena began gathering her few possessions, a change of clothes, a worn paperback book, a small bottle of hand lotion that smelled like vanilla. I know you own this building. I know you could fire me with a phone call. I know your shoes cost more than I make in a month cleaning floors that you kind of walk on without seeing the people who make them shine. Each word was a precise cut, revealing truths David had spent decades avoiding. He thought of his penthouse overlooking Grant Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Chicago that most people could only dream of seeing. He thought of his garage in Austin filled with cars worth more than most people's houses. He thought of his Miami Beach estate, empty except for housekeepers who cleaned around his absence. You're right, he said, the admission tearing from his throat like a confession. I don't see people like you. I don't see anyone really. But I'm not trying to take advantage of you. Elena paused in her packing, something in his tone making her look up. For the first time, she saw past the expensive suit and authoritative bearing to the man underneath. Tired, alone, and suddenly human in a way that caught her off guard. Then what do you want? She asked. David stared at her for a long moment, searching for an answer that made sense. What did he want? To assuage his guilt? To feel like something other than a predator in $1,000 suit? To prove to himself that he was capable of kindness without expectation of return? I don't know, he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. I just know that walking away and pretending I didn't see you feels wrong. Elena's defensive stance softened slightly, but wariness remained etched in every line of her body. Wrong for who? For me, sleeping in supply closets and dodging security? Or wrong for you, having to face what your kind of success costs other people? The question hit its mark with surgical precision. David had built his empire by never asking those kinds of questions, by focusing on profit margins instead of human costs. His companies had foreclosed on homes from Detroit to Phoenix, had laid off workers from Seattle to Tampa, had prioritized shareholder value over human dignity. Standing here, confronted by the human cost of his success, he felt something crack inside his chest. "Both," he said quietly. Elena studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or ulterior motive. She'd learned to read men's intentions through years of disappointment and betrayal. But David's expression held something she hadn't expected. Genuine confusion, as if he was surprising himself as much as her. "I can't trust you," she said finally. "I won't trust you. My daughter depends on me, and I can't risk her future on the charity of someone who's never had to choose between dignity and survival." "So what happens now?" David asked. "You sleep here until security finds you? Until you're arrested for trespassing? Until you lose this job too?" Elena flinched at the accuracy of his assessment. She'd been operating on borrowed time since the first night, knowing that discovery was inevitable. But accepting help felt like stepping into quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you sank. "I figured it out," she said with more conviction than she felt. "I always figure it out. Isabella and I don't need rescue. We need opportunity. And those are two very different things." David nodded slowly, understanding more than she expected. Opportunity. Not charity. Exactly. Elena shouldered her canvas bag, preparing to leave the supply closet and face whatever consequences awaited. Charity makes you dependent. Opportunity makes you strong. As she moved toward the door, David realized he was about to let something important slip away. Not just Elena, but a chance to be something other than the ruthless machine he'd become. The recognition terrified and compelled him in equal measure. "Elena," he called as she reached the threshold. She turned back, her name sounding different in his voice than it had in years. Less like a designation on a payroll, more like an acknowledgement of her humanity. "What if I could offer you an opportunity instead of charity?" The executive break room on the 20th floor felt like another planet compared to the supply closet's cramped confines. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the Willis Tower standing sentinel against the star-pricked darkness, while Lake Michigan stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her canvas bag clutched against her chest like a shield. "Sit," David commanded, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a mahogany conference table. When she hesitated, he added with less edge, "Please." Elena perched on the chair's edge, ready to flee at the first sign of security guards or police. The room smelled of expensive coffee and success, scents as foreign to her current reality as the Italian marble floors beneath her worn sneakers. Through the windows, she could see the lights of her old neighborhood near Wicker Park, where Isabella had taken her first steps, where they'd been a family before everything shattered. David moved to the coffee machine, his movements mechanical but purposeful. "When did you last eat?" He asked the question to the machine rather than her, as if direct eye contact might break whatever fragile truce they'd established. "I'm not hungry." The lie came automatically protective. Elena had learned that admitting need often led to either pity or exploitation, both equally dangerous for a woman alone. "That's not what I asked." David's reflection in the window showed a man wrestling with unfamiliar territory. In boardrooms from Miami to Seattle, he controlled every conversation, every outcome. But facing Elena's quiet desperation, his usual weapons felt useless. "When did you last eat a real meal?" Elena's silence stretched until it became its own answer. She watched him prepare 2 cups of coffee with the same precision he'd probably applied to multimillion-dollar deals. His hands were manicured, soft from a life insulated from physical labor, yet they moved with surprising gentleness around the delicate porcelain. "There's a sandwich shop in the lobby," David said, setting a steaming cup before her. "Giuseppe's. They make Italian beef that would make my grandmother weep with joy. She used to run a similar place in Little Italy, back when that meant something in Chicago." Elena wrapped her hands around the mug's warmth, inhaling steam that carried notes of vanilla and something expensive she couldn't identify. "I know Giuseppe's. I clean their windows every Tuesday morning. Giuseppe always waves, even though—" She trailed off, not wanting to complete the thought. "Even though I'm invisible to everyone else." "Even though what?" David settled across from her, his imposing frame somehow less threatening in the room's soft lighting. "Even though most people look through me like I'm part of the building." Elena met his eyes directly for the first time, searching for judgment and finding only unexpected curiosity. "When you clean offices, you hear everything. Business deals, personal calls, family arguments. But no one worries about the janitor listening because we don't exist to them." David felt an uncomfortable recognition in her words. How many times had he discussed sensitive matters in front of maintenance staff, treating them like furniture with hands? "What do you hear?" A ghost of a smile crossed Elena's features. "Mr. Patterson on 15 is having an affair with his accountant. Mrs. Chen from marketing is pregnant but hasn't told her husband yet because they're going through a rough patch. And you—" She paused, studying his face. "You never talk on the phone after midnight anymore. You used to about 6 months ago. Long conversations with someone named Michael about properties in Austin and investment opportunities in Miami Beach. But not anymore." The observation hit David like a physical blow. Michael had been his business partner, his closest friend, the best man at his wedding to Victoria. A marriage that had dissolved 2 years ago in a flurry of lawyers and accusations of emotional abandonment. Michael had chosen sides, taking half their shared investments and David's remaining connection to anything resembling friendship. "Observant," David said quietly. "And accurate." Elena sensed she'd touched something raw and important. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "No." David's voice carried a weariness that expensive suits and luxury cars couldn't mask. "You're probably the only person in this building who's actually paying attention." He studied her face in the soft light, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the careful way she held herself despite exhaustion. "You could have blackmailed half my executives with what you've overheard." "I would never," Elena began, then stopped, understanding his point. "You don't know me. You have no reason to trust that." "I have no reason to trust anyone," David admitted. "But somehow I'm sitting here at 4 a.m. with a woman I found sleeping in my supply closet, and it feels like the most honest conversation I've had in months." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and dangerous. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that beneath his expensive armor, David Hartwell might be as isolated as she was desperate. The thought both frightened and intrigued her. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. "Most people in your position would have called security immediately." David stared out at Chicago's skyline, at the empire he'd built one calculated decision at a time. "Maybe because I'm tired of being the kind of person who would call security immediately." A comfortable silence settled over them, broken only by the building's mechanical whispers and the distant hum of late-night traffic on Lakeshore Drive. Elena sipped her coffee, tasting luxury she'd forgotten existed, while David wrestled with emotions he'd spent decades burying. "I need to ask you something," David said finally. "And I need you to be completely honest." Elena tensed, preparing for questions about theft, about compromising security, about violations that could destroy even her tenuous employment. Okay. Are you safe? The question came out rougher than he'd intended. Besides needing a place to sleep, is anyone hurting you? Threatening you? The unexpected concern in his voice nearly undid Elena's carefully maintained composure. When had anyone last asked if she was safe? When did her well-being matter to someone with the power to actually help? I'm not running from anyone if that's what you're asking, she said carefully. Just running toward something better. For Isabella. David nodded, though something in her tone suggested layers of truth she wasn't ready to share. The building has security cameras everywhere except the supply closets and bathrooms. I checked. Elena's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. You checked. After I found you. I wanted to know how long you'd been invisible. David's voice carried something that might have been shameful. 3 nights, like you said. And you're right. The cameras show you working efficiently, professionally. You finish your assignments an hour early every night. Are you going to fire me? The question came out smaller than Elena intended. David looked at her then. Really looked, as if seeing her for the first time as a person rather than a problem to be solved. I'm going to make you a proposition. How would you react if someone in power offered to help you in your darkest moment? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes a single act of kindness changes everything. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Elena set down her coffee cup with trembling hands, knowing that whatever David Hartwell was about to offer would alter the trajectory of her life forever. The rain against Elena's apartment window created a rhythm that matched her heartbeat as she sat across from David in her modest living space near Little Village. 3 days had passed since their arrangement began, and the careful distance they'd maintained was about to shatter completely. David's eyes swept across the small but immaculately clean apartment. Hand-me-down furniture arranged with artistic precision, Isabella's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a single-framed photo of Elena in a graduation cap and gown from Northwestern University. The last detail stopped him cold. You went to Northwestern? He asked, picking up the frame. Elena's cheeks flushed as she poured coffee into mismatched mugs. Business Administration. Graduated summa cum laude in 2018. Her voice carried both pride and pain. I had plans. Big dreams about working in corporate America, maybe even for a company like yours someday. David studied the photograph. Elena beaming beside an older woman who shared her determined eyes and warm smile. What happened? Life happened. Elena settled into the threadbare armchair across from him, cradling her coffee like warmth itself. I met Roberto my senior year. He was charming, ambitious, talked about building an empire together. We moved to Austin after graduation. He had connections in real estate there. Got married, had Isabella, started what I thought was our future. The mention of Austin made David's chest tighten. His own company had major holdings there, gleaming towers where other people's dreams were bought and sold daily. And then, Elena's fingers traced the rim of her mug, years of buried hurt surfacing in her dark eyes. Roberto's connections turned out to be gambling debts and cocaine habits. The real estate deals were money laundering schemes. By the time I realized what he'd gotten us into, we were drowning in debt and danger. She paused, gathering strength. When Isabella got pneumonia at age 4, I sold everything we owned to pay her medical bills. Roberto cleaned out our bank account and disappeared to Vegas the night she was released from the hospital. David felt something crack inside his chest. He'd built his empire on the principle that weakness was failure. that struggling people simply hadn't worked hard enough. But looking at Elena, brilliant, educated, destroyed by loving the wrong person, his worldview began to crumble. I moved us to Chicago thinking I could start over, Elena continued. But try explaining employment gaps to recruiters when your husband's criminal activity destroys your references. Try finding corporate work when your address is a shelter in Humboldt Park. The cleaning job was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. That was 4 years ago, David said quietly. 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Elena's precision revealed how carefully she'd counted each moment of struggle. Isabella barely remembers the house in Austin, the life before. To her, this is normal. Mama working nights, living with strangers, video calls instead of bedtime stories. David stood and walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. His own penthouse was visible in the distance, a glittering monument to everything Elena had lost. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Would it have mattered? Elena's question hung in the air like an accusation. Rich men don't usually care about janitors' backstories. We're invisible until we're inconvenient. The words hit David like physical blows because they were true. How many Elena Martinezes had he walked past in his buildings from Miami to Manhattan, never seeing their humanity, their stories, their dreams deferred by circumstances beyond their control? Elena rose and retrieved a small wooden box from her bedroom. Inside, David glimpsed letters, certificates, and photographs, the remnants of a life that once held promise. She pulled out a business plan, pages yellowed with time and handling. I wrote this during my senior year at Northwestern, she said, handing it to him. A microfinance company focused on helping immigrant families start small businesses. I researched it for 2 years, and had meetings with potential investors in Chicago's Loop District. David read the first page, his business acumen immediately recognizing the brilliance of her concept. The financial projections were sophisticated, the market analysis thorough, the social impact profound. This is exceptional work. Roberto called it naive idealism. Said real money came from taking advantage of people, not helping them. Elena's voice carried the weight of dreams murdered by cynicism. After he left, I tried to resurrect it. But investors don't take meetings with women living in shelters. Banks don't approve loans when your credit is destroyed by your husband's drug debts. David continued reading, each page revealing a mind capable of transforming lives and communities. Elena hadn't just been a casualty of circumstance. She'd been a visionary destroyed by trusting the wrong person. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, who'd spent decades acquiring companies and dismissing dreams, was holding a business plan that could have changed thousands of lives. There's something else, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 2019, yellowed and carefully preserved. The headline read, Hartwell Financial acquires Austin Development Group. $50 million deal transforms East Side. David's blood turned to ice water. Austin Development Group had been one of his most profitable acquisitions, a company he'd gutted for its prime real estate holdings before dissolving it completely. Roberto worked for Austin Development Group, Elena said, watching recognition dawn on David's face. When your company acquired them, he was supposed to be laid off with severance. Instead, he stole client funds and disappeared, leaving me to face the investigators alone. The room spun around David as pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed clicked into place. His acquisition of Austin Development Group had inadvertently destroyed Elena's life, scattered the pieces of her world from Texas to Chicago. The woman sleeping in his supply closet, the brilliant mind serving as an invisible janitor, had been collateral damage in his empire's expansion. You knew, Elena said, studying his stricken expression. Not about me specifically, but you knew Austin Development Group was dirty when you bought it. You knew there would be casualties. David couldn't deny it. Due diligence had revealed the company's questionable practices, but the profit margins had been too attractive to ignore. He'd convinced himself that cleaning house was just business, that the displaced employees would find other opportunities. He'd never considered that some might be innocent spouses trapped by criminal husbands, left to raise sick children alone while their worlds collapsed. Elena, I don't. She held up her hand, tears streaming down her face. Don't apologize. Don't explain business necessity or market forces or any of the things rich men say when their profits destroy lives. Just don't. The wooden box slipped from Elena's hands, scattering photographs and documents across the floor. Images of Isabella as a baby, of Elena's Northwestern graduation, of family celebrations that would never happen again. David knelt to help gather them, but Elena pulled away as if his touch burned. I need you to leave, she whispered. David stood slowly, the business plan still clutched in his hands. Elena, please. Let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Her voice broke completely. The man who destroyed my life has been playing savior for 3 days. The irony is perfect, don't you think? As David walked toward the door, Elena's voice stopped him one final time. The worst part is that I was starting to believe you were different. That maybe decent men still existed somewhere in your world of glass towers and marble lobbies. The door closed behind David with devastating finality, leaving him alone in the hallway with the weight of Elena's shattered dreams and the terrible knowledge that his empire had been built on foundations of broken lives he'd never bothered to see. Do you think people can truly change when they discover the real cost of their success? Share your story of transformation below. In his hands, Elena's business plan felt like an accusation, a roadmap to redemption he might already be too late to follow. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the windows of David's penthouse office as he found Elena exactly where he'd left her. Curled in the leather chair, Isabella's photograph pressed against her chest. She stirred as his footsteps approached, instantly alert with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary. You stayed, she said, surprise coloring her voice as she took in his rumpled clothes, the coffee-stained shirt that had cost more than her monthly salary. I promised I would. David set down 2 cups of coffee from the building's executive kitchen, the rich aroma filling the space between them. Cream, no sugar. You mentioned that yesterday. Elena accepted the cup with hands that no longer trembled, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. In all my years of cleaning offices, I never imagined sitting in one of these chairs as anything other than furniture to dust around. She took a sip, closing her eyes at the luxury of freshly ground Colombian beans. This probably costs more than I make in a day. Probably. David settled into the chair across from her, noting how the morning light softened her features, revealing the woman she might have been without years of struggle etched into every line. But yesterday I learned that cost and value aren't the same thing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out beneath them like a promise. Lake Michigan glittering in the distance, the Willis Tower standing sentinel over a city that had shaped them both. Elena followed his gaze, wondering about replacing the wariness that had defined their interactions. I used to bring Isabella to Navy Pier every Sunday when she was smaller, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of better times. She loved the Ferris wheel, and insisted we ride it 3 times every visit. Said she could see all the way to Los Angeles from the top, where her dreams lived. A smile ghosted across her lips. Children believe in impossible things. What did you believe in? David asked, leaning forward despite himself. Elena was quiet for a long moment, steam rising from her coffee cup like incense between them. I believed in forever. In promises that meant something. In the idea that working hard and loving completely would be enough to build a life that couldn't be torn apart by one person's selfishness or one child's illness. And now I believe in making it through each day until I can hold my daughter again. Elena's eyes met his, and David saw steel wrapped in vulnerability, strength forged from survival. What about you? What does a man who owns half of Chicago believe in? David's laugh held no humor. I used to believe in winning. Every acquisition from Miami Beach to Silicon Valley was proof that I could take anything I wanted, build anything I imagined. Success was my religion, profit my prayer. Used to. 3 days ago, I discovered that empires built on other people's sacrifices are just elaborate monuments to loneliness. David set down his cup, his hand steady despite the admission that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I've been so busy accumulating that I forgot to live. Elena studied his face in the morning light, seeing past the expensive haircut and designer clothes to something raw and surprisingly honest. Loneliness is different when you choose it versus when it chooses you. Is it? I've been alone in penthouses from Manhattan to Beverly Hills, surrounded by everything money can buy and nothing that matters. You've been alone in shelters and supply closets, surrounded by nothing but still fighting for someone you love. David's voice carried an ache he hadn't acknowledged before. Which of us has been living? Both of us have been surviving, Elena said softly. Maybe that's enough to start with. They sat in comfortable silence, the morning energy of the city building beyond the windows. Employees began arriving in the lobby 17 floors below, starting another day in careers that probably felt safer than Elena's but perhaps no more meaningful than David's had become. Tell me about her, David said suddenly. Isabella. Tell me who she is beyond that photograph. Elena's face transformed, love smoothing away years of worry lines. She's fearless in ways I never was. Last Christmas, before everything fell apart, she insisted on singing Silent Night at her school's concert even though she'd forgotten half the words. Just stood there making up her own lyrics about snowflakes and hot chocolate until the whole audience was laughing. Elena's smile was radiant, authentic joy breaking through clouds of circumstance. She has this way of finding magic in ordinary things. Puddle jumping after rain, making faces at herself in store windows, convincing me that cereal for dinner is actually a celebration meal. She sounds extraordinary. She is. And she deserves better than a mother who sleeps in supply closets and counts quarters for bus fare. Elena's voice caught slightly. Every day I'm away from her, she grows a little more independent, needs me a little less. I'm terrified that by the time I can bring her home, she'll have learned to live without me. David felt something crack open in his chest, a familiar pain he'd spent decades burying. My father worked himself to death trying to give me opportunities he never had. 3 jobs, night school, weekend construction. Also I could have choices he'd never dreamed of. He died when I was Isabella's age, and for years I was angry that he'd chosen work over time with me. And now I understand that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, that fathers and mothers carry weights their children can't see. David's eyes found Elena's, holding steady despite the vulnerability of truth. He didn't choose work over me. He chose my future over his present. The way you're doing for Isabella. Elena set down her coffee cup, tears threatening for the first time since he'd found her in that closet. Some days I wonder if I'm just telling myself stories to justify failing her. You're not failing her. You're fighting for her. There's a difference. David rose and moved to the window, gesturing toward the city sprawling beneath them. Every building down there represents someone's dream, someone's struggle, someone's refusal to give up. You belong in this view, Elena. Your story matters as much as any empire. Elena joined him at the window, their reflections ghost-like in the glass. Two people from different worlds finding unexpected common ground in the space between judgment and compassion. Why are you being kind to me? David considered the question, searching for honesty in a life built on strategic calculations. Because yesterday morning, I was a different person. Successful but empty. Powerful but powerless to create anything that mattered. You changed that. I was just trying to survive. No, David turned to face her, his voice carrying certainty that surprised them both. You were showing me what courage looks like. What love in action means. What it costs to build something real instead of just profitable. Elena's breath caught at the intensity in his voice. The way his usually cold eyes had warmed to something that looked almost like wonder. David. I want to help you bring Isabella home, he said, the words tumbling out before caution could stop them. Not as charity, not as guilt money, but as someone who finally understands that the best investments aren't in property or stocks, they're in people who remind us what we're living for. Have you ever met someone who changed your entire perspective in just a few days? Tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful transformations come from the most unexpected connections. The morning light shifted, casting their intertwined reflections across the Chicago skyline. Two souls finding healing in the space between where they'd come from and where they might go together. The morning sun cast long shadows across David's Chicago penthouse as he stared at the legal documents scattered across his mahogany desk. 24 hours had passed since the Christmas Eve celebration at the community center. Since Elena's kiss had awakened something he'd thought permanently buried. But now Harrison Reynolds sat across from him, briefcase open, wearing the satisfied expression of a man about to deliver devastating news. I told you to be careful, David. Harrison's voice carried the condescending tone that had grated on David's nerves since their Harvard law days. But you never listen when it comes to women, do you? David's hands clenched into fists as Harrison slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were photographs. Grainy surveillance shots of Elena entering and leaving various buildings across Chicago. Timestamps spanning the past 3 months. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the locations. High-end hotels in River North, exclusive condos in Lincoln Park, luxury apartments on the Gold Coast. Elena Martinez, Harrison continued, his words precise as surgical cuts, professionally known as Lena in certain circles. She's been working an elaborate con, David. The whole desperate single mother routine? Sleeping in supply closets? Pure theater designed to hook wealthy marks like you. You're lying. David's voice came out strangled, but his certainty wavered as Harrison spread more photographs across the desk. Elena laughing over champagne with a silver-haired man outside the Four Seasons. Elena in an expensive dress entering a Millennium Park penthouse. Elena counted cash in what looked like a hotel room. The girl, Isabella, she doesn't exist. We've checked birth records, school enrollments, immigration documents. Elena Martinez has no daughter, David. She's a professional grifter who's been running variations of the scam from Miami Beach to Seattle. The crying child routine, the desperate mother act, it's all calculated to manipulate successful men into opening their wallets and their hearts. David's world tilted as Harrison produced a typed report. She's been feeding information about your business dealings to competitors. The Hartwell Foundation's donor list, your acquisition plans for the Austin tech companies, even details about your Miami Beach property investments. She's not just stealing your money, David. She's selling your secrets. The photographs blurred as David stared at them, his chest constricting with each damning image. Elena in designer clothes he'd never seen. Elena with men he didn't recognize. Elena looking nothing like the broken, desperate woman who'd trembled in his arms just yesterday, who'd whispered about bringing her daughter home for Christmas. The community center event yesterday? Harrison's smile was razor sharp. She wasn't volunteering out of the goodness of her heart. She was gathering intelligence on your charitable activities, probably planning to rob the donation fund or identify other wealthy targets among your associates. David's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Thank you for yesterday. Being with you felt like coming home. Can we meet tonight? I have something important to tell you." The message that should have warmed his heart now felt like mockery. Another manipulation in an elaborate game he'd been too blind to see. "The timing is particularly clever," Harrison continued, relentlessly as a prosecution attorney. "Christmas Eve, the emotional vulnerability, the kiss, all designed to lower your defenses before she made her final move. We estimate she's already extracted close to $200,000 from you through various means. The apartment, the car, the credit cards, the medical expenses for a child who doesn't exist." David stood abruptly, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The city stretched before him, his empire, his domain, his carefully constructed world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. How could he have been so stupid? How could he have believed that someone could love him for anything other than his money? "There's more." Harrison's voice carried false sympathy. "She's been in contact with journalists. We intercepted communications suggesting she's planning to sell her story. How I Fooled a Millionaire, the David Hartwell seduction. Your reputation, your business relationships, everything you've built could be destroyed by scandal." The photographs seemed to mock David from the desk. Elena's smile looked different now, calculating instead of shy, predatory instead of vulnerable. The woman who'd made him believe in second chances was nothing more than an actress playing a role, and he'd been the perfect mark. Lonely, isolated, hungry for genuine connection. His phone rang, Elena's name on the caller ID. David stared at it, remembering the way she'd said his name like a prayer, the way she'd looked at him as if he were her salvation instead of her target. The ringing stopped, then immediately started again. "Don't answer," Harrison advised. "We've already contacted the authorities. Chicago PD wants to question her about similar scams in Denver and Detroit. Apparently, she's left a trail of wealthy victims across the Midwest." David's finger hovered over the answer button as Elena's face filled his screen. The photo he'd taken of her laughing at Navy Pier, snowflakes caught in her dark hair. Even knowing what he knew now, his heart lurched at her image. The ringing stopped. Then a voicemail notification appeared. "David, please call me back." Elena's recorded voice pleaded through the phone speaker. "Something wonderful has happened. I got the call about the job in Los Angeles, the one I interviewed for last month. They want me to start after New Year's, and the salary is enough to get a place for Isabella and me. I know it means leaving Chicago, leaving you, but maybe you could visit? Maybe we could make this work. I love you, David. I know it's crazy fast, but I do. Call me." Harrison shook his head. Even now, she's working the angle. The job story is probably fabricated to create urgency, to push you into making some grand gesture before she disappears with whatever she can steal. David deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest, his thumb moving mechanically. The woman he'd thought might save him was nothing more than another predator in expensive clothing, and he'd been fool enough to bare his throat to her teeth. "What do you recommend?" David's voice sounded hollow, defeated. "Complete severance. Change your passwords, cancel her access to everything, alert your security team. I've already had the locks changed on properties she had access to. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division is interested in building a case against her network. Apparently, this goes much deeper than just your situation." David nodded mechanically, his business mind taking over where his heart had failed him. Trust was a luxury he'd learned to avoid, and Elena had reminded him why. The fantasy of love, of connection, of someone seeing him as more than a bank account. It had all been as artificial as the photographs Harrison continued to spread across his desk. And David. Harrison's voice carried a warning. "When she comes looking for you, and she will once she realizes you know the truth, don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. She's dangerous precisely because she's good at making men believe she cares about them." Outside the penthouse windows, Chicago's skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, beautiful and cold as the city that had taught David his first lessons about survival. He'd built his empire on the principle that everyone had a price, that trust was weakness, that love was just another word for vulnerability. Elena Martinez had almost made him forget those lessons. Almost. But Harrison's evidence was undeniable, and David Hartwell hadn't become one of the most successful businessmen in America by ignoring facts in favor of feelings. The woman he'd thought might be his salvation was just another predator, and he'd been lucky to discover the truth before she could destroy everything he'd built. His phone buzzed again, another text from Elena. "David? Are you okay? I'm worried. Please just let me know you're safe." David blocked her number and turned back to Harrison's photographs, studying the evidence of his own stupidity. The woman in these pictures bore no resemblance to the broken, desperate janitor he'd found sleeping in his supply closet. This Elena was polished, confident, predatory. Everything the real Elena had pretended not to be. "Schedule a meeting with legal," David said, his voice returning to its familiar coldness. "I want restraining orders, cease and desist letters, whatever it takes to ensure she never comes near me or my businesses again. And Harrison. Find out everything about her network. If she's been running this con across multiple states, I want every one of her accomplices prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." As Harrison gathered his photographs and documents, David stood at his window watching the city that had made him rich but left him empty. For 72 hours, he'd believed in the possibility of something real. Now that fantasy was dead, buried under evidence of calculated deception, and David Hartwell was exactly where he'd always been, alone, wealthy, and utterly untouchable. The woman who'd made him believe in love had been the cruelest lie of all. David sat alone in his Manhattan penthouse at 4:17 a.m., the city's lights blurring through windows he hadn't bothered to clean since Elena left. 3 days had passed since their confrontation in the parking garage of Hartwell Financial. 3 days since she'd walked away with her canvas bag and wounded dignity intact. The silence in his apartment felt different now. Not the comfortable isolation of success, but the hollow ache of genuine loss. His phone buzzed with messages from his Miami Beach property manager, updates from the Austin tech acquisition, reports from his Seattle investment firm. Numbers that once thrilled him now felt like noise, meaningless data streams that couldn't fill the Elena-shaped void in his chest. He'd built an empire spanning from Chicago's financial district to the California coastline, but sitting here in the dark, he felt poorer than he'd ever been. 17 floors below, Elena's replacement janitor worked the supply closet where she'd once slept. David had checked the security cameras obsessively, hoping for some glimpse of her return, but she'd vanished into Chicago's 8 million souls as completely as if she'd never existed. The only proof of their connection was the ache in his ribs every time he walked past the 20th floor, the phantom scent of vanilla and determination that seemed to linger in impossible places. Elena sat on a bench in Lincoln Park, watching early morning joggers circle the lagoon as Isabella slept against her shoulder. She'd used most of her remaining savings for the flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, telling herself it was temporary, just until she could find new work, new housing, new hope. But 3 days of job hunting in LA's sprawling streets had yielded nothing but rejection, and her sister Carmen's patience was wearing thin. "Mama, when are we going home?" Isabella murmured, her small hand clutching Elena's jacket as Chicago tourists fed ducks near the water's edge. Home. The word twisted in Elena's chest like a blade. Home had been the possibility of bringing Isabella back to Chicago for Christmas, of rebuilding their life in the city where she'd first learned to dream. Now it felt like another fantasy she'd been foolish to pursue, another promise she couldn't keep to the daughter who'd already lost so much. David's fingers hovered over his phone, Elena's number still saved in his contacts from their conversation about overtime schedules. He'd drafted 17 messages in the past 3 days, each one deleted before sending. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry. That he'd let pride and fear destroy something real? That for the first time in 20 years, money felt meaningless compared to the warmth of human connection? The Miami acquisition his lawyers had been pushing could wait. The Austin property development could find another investor. Even the Seattle tech startup's IPO felt insignificant compared to the choice that lay before him now. He could retreat into his empire of glass and steel, convincing himself that what happened with Elena was a moment of weakness, a temporary lapse in judgment. Or he could do something that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or market crash. He could admit that she'd changed him. Elena's phone rang as she watched Isabella chase pigeons near the Lincoln Park Zoo entrance. Carmen's name flashed on the screen, and Elena's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Her sister had been patient, had offered shelter when Elena had nowhere else to turn, but 3 adults and 2 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in East LA was straining everyone's limits. "Elena, we need to talk." Carmen's voice carried the weight of difficult conversations. Miguel got called back to the night shift at the port. "We need Isabella's room for his equipment storage. I'm sorry, but you both have to find somewhere else by Sunday." 4 days. Elena closed her eyes, doing the mathematics of survival that had become second nature. Her remaining cash would cover maybe a week in the cheapest motel she could find. But then what? McDonald's applications from Riverside to San Diego had yielded nothing. The cleaning companies in LA were oversaturated with workers more established, more connected, more fortunate than a single mother who'd fled Chicago with nothing but hope and determination. David stood and walked to his window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. The city stretched below him, millions of lights representing millions of lives, millions of stories he'd never bothered to learn. Somewhere in those lights were people sleeping in supply closets, working 3 jobs, children missing parents who'd chosen pride over love. He thought of his grandmother in Southside Chicago, how she'd taught him that wealth meant nothing if it couldn't be shared, that power was meaningless if it couldn't lift others up. The choice crystallized with sudden, terrifying clarity. He could remain David Hartwell, the millionaire who'd built an empire from Detroit's ashes to Oregon's tech corridors, who commanded respect in boardrooms from Miami Beach to Manhattan's financial district. Or he could become the man Elena had seen glimpses of, someone capable of love, of sacrifice, of choosing connection over control. Elena lifted Isabella and walked toward the park's exit, her daughter's weight solid and warm against her chest. They'd find a way forward somehow. They always had. But as she reached the street, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Chicago number. "I was wrong. About everything. Please come home. David." Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. Home. That word again, but this time carrying the weight of possibility, of a choice that could change everything. Isabella stirred in her arms, and Elena realized she was crying. Not from despair, but from the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, love was still possible in a world that had taught her to expect nothing. The next flight to Chicago left LAX at 11:47 p.m. Elena had exactly $437 in her wallet, Isabella's sleepy trust in her arms, and a text message that felt like a door opening in a wall she'd thought was permanent. The choice wasn't about David, or his money, or the security he could provide. The choice was about believing that she deserved love, that Isabella deserved a father figure who would choose them over fear, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is hope. In your life, when as taking a terrifying leap of faith led to something beautiful. Share your story in the comments. You might inspire someone else to choose courage. She booked the tickets with shaking fingers, knowing that in 12 hours, she'd be walking back into Hartwell Financial Tower, not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone brave enough to claim the love she'd finally learned she deserved. The morning sun painted Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and promise as David stood outside the modest two-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, keys trembling in his hand. 6 months had passed since that night in the supply closet. 6 months of the most profound transformation either of them had ever experienced. Today, Isabella was coming home. Elena emerged from the building's entrance, her face radiant with a joy that had been building for weeks. Gone was the exhausted janitor who'd slept among cleaning supplies. In her place stood a woman reborn, confident in her role as community outreach director for the Hartwell Foundation, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the elegant clothes David had tried to buy her and everything to do with the peace that had settled in her eyes. "She'll be here any minute," Elena said, checking her phone for the third time. Maria's flight from LAX landed an hour ago. David nodded, his throat tight with emotion he was still learning to navigate. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms from Miami Beach to Silicon Valley now found himself nervous about meeting a 6-year-old girl, the most important person in Elena's world, and therefore in his. "Are you ready for this?" Elena asked, studying his face with the intuitive understanding that had grown between them through months of late-night conversations, shared meals, and the gradual dismantling of walls they'd both built around their hearts. "I've been ready since the night I found you," David replied, and meant it with a certainty that still amazed him. The discovery had changed everything. Not just his life, but his understanding of what life could be. A yellow taxi turned the corner from North Wells Street, and Elena's entire body tensed with anticipation. Through the rear window, David caught a glimpse of dark curls and bright eyes that mirrored Elena's. Isabella, the little girl whose photograph had started this unlikely journey from the supply closet to something that felt impossibly like home. "Mama!" Isabella's voice rang across the street as she tumbled from the taxi, her small legs carrying her faster than seemed possible. Elena met her halfway, sweeping her daughter into arms that had ached with emptiness for too long. David watched from a respectful distance as mother and daughter held each other, Elena's tears mixing with Isabella's excited chatter about airplanes and clouds and how Chicago looked bigger than Isabella remembered. Maria, Elena's sister, approached with Isabella's suitcase, her eyes finding David with curious approval. "So you're the miracle worker," Maria said quietly, extending her hand. Elena told me about the man who changed everything. I have to admit, I was skeptical when she called about moving into an apartment she could actually afford, getting a job that used her college degree, bringing Isabella home. She changed everything, David corrected, his voice soft as he watched Elena lift Isabella, spinning her around as both of them laughed. I just got lucky enough to find her. Elena approached with Isabella on her hip, the little girl's shy eyes studying David with the frank curiosity of childhood. Isabella, this is David. He's very special to us. Are you Mama's boyfriend? Isabella asked with 6-year-old directness that made both adults laugh. I'm your Mama's friend, David said carefully, kneeling to Isabella's eye level. And I hope I can be your friend too. Isabella considered this with serious deliberation before nodding. Mama says you helped her get our new apartment. It has a park across the street. It does, David confirmed. And if your mama says it's okay, maybe we could go see it together sometime. Can we go now? Isabella's excitement was infectious, and Elena laughed. The sound David had grown to love more than any symphony performed in Boston's finest halls or New York's most prestigious venues. Let's get you settled first, mi amor, Elena said, but her eyes met David's with a warmth that made his chest tighten with happiness he was still learning to trust. As they walked toward the apartment building, Isabella chattered about Los Angeles and Aunt Maria and the airplane food, but David found himself remembering that first night. Elena's terrified eyes in the supply closet, the photograph that had fallen between them, the moment when everything he thought he knew about success and meaning crumbled and rebuilt itself around something infinitely more valuable. David, Elena said quietly as Isabella ran ahead to examine the building's front garden. I need to tell you something. He tensed, old fears of loss and abandonment surfacing despite months of growing trust. That night you found me, Elena continued. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything. My home, my dignity, any chance of bringing Isabella back. I was ready to give up. Elena. Let me finish, she said, touching his arm gently. You saved me, but not in the way you think. It wasn't the job or the apartment or the foundation. It was the way you looked at me that night, not like I was a problem to be solved or a charity case to be managed, but like I was worth seeing, worth knowing. David felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood threatening to surface. You made me remember who I used to be before I became so afraid of feeling anything that I stopped feeling everything. They paused at the building's entrance, Isabella already pressing elevator buttons with the focused concentration of a child on an important mission. The 6 months since that night in Hartwell Financial Tower had transformed more than their circumstances. It had transformed them, separately and together. What happens now? David asked, the question carrying weight beyond logistics and into the territory of hearts and hopes and the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone completely. Elena smiled, the expression holding all the warmth that had been missing from David's life for 42 years. Now we build something new. Not your empire or my survival, but ours. Together. I love you, David said, the words coming easier each time but never losing their power to surprise him with their truth. I love you too, Elena replied, and kissed him softly as Isabella's delighted laughter echoed in the elevator shaft above them. As they entered the building that would be their home, not his or hers, but theirs, David thought about the chain of events that had led them here. A sleepless night, a partially opened door, a photograph, and the courage to see past surfaces to the person beneath. The supply closet in Hartwell Financial Tower sat empty now, cleaned and organized, holding only industrial supplies and the ghost of a desperate woman who'd needed shelter. But sometimes, late at night when David walked those familiar halls, He remembered the moment when his carefully constructed world had cracked open to reveal something infinitely more valuable than wealth. The possibility of love, redemption, and the radical transformation that happens when two broken people choose to heal together. In the apartment above, Isabella's laughter mixed with Elena's gentle corrections and David's deeper chuckles, creating the symphony of family. Messy, complicated, beautiful, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. What do you believe is the true measure of success? The money we accumulate or the lives we touch? Share your thoughts below and let us know how this story changed your perspective on what really matters. 6 months after finding Elena in that supply closet, David Hartwell had finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not another acquisition or achievement, but home. And sometimes, when Isabella fell asleep between them during movie nights, Elena's head on his shoulder and the future stretching bright with possibility, he whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force had led him to open that door and discover that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unexpected places. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.